Hey everyone, welcome to the SingularityComputers giveaway Waterbox upgrades part 2. This was first prize in my recent giveaway, and I said that before I gave it away I was going to upgrade it. At the end of the last video I started taking a look at the components that are going back into the Waterbox. The rest of the components have arrived, so I'm now going to take a look at those. So I have a BitsPower X Station, the white version, because as I've mentioned the new color scheme of this Waterbox is going to be black and white. The rest of the noise blocker E-loops have arrived. The version that I'm using is the B12-2. I have some Mayhem's Pastel Ice White Coolant, a 22mm white ring Vandal switch, a couple of UN mounts. Now these are going to be for the dual pumps, and UN makes a wide range of different mounts that can be used for just about anything. I use UN mounts in almost every single one of my builds. I also have some of the new Coolants quick disconnects. Now, not only do these have a new design, there's also a whole bunch of different options, including this one which has a 1/2 inch thread on the outside and a 1/4 inch thread on the inside. Now, you can just imagine the different configurations that are possible with this particular quick disconnect. It just so happens that this Waterbox came with 2 1/2 inch threads tapped into the side of it. So I'm able to screw this quick disconnect straight into the side of the Waterbox and then use any fittings I want on the inside in the 1/4 inch thread. I also have some Mod My Toys splitter PCBs for the fans. That's all of the components that are going into the Waterbox. It's time to get started. I've now installed all of the fans onto the radiators. These radiators are black ISSR ones. They have a 9 FPI. The specifications of the noise blocker E-loop B12-2, 1300 RPM, 16.7 decibels, 51.1 CFM and 1.042 millimeters H2O. I've also installed the quick disconnects. You can see how they're configured with the 1/4 inch threads on the inside. I'll be able to connect my fittings straight to them. So they now have a push fitting design compared to the previous design where you had to rotate them to engage and disengage them. This design is far more reliable for a number of different reasons. I've also installed the reservoir onto one of the radiators. I've used 2 UNZ2 brackets. They're 120mm brackets, one on the top fan and one on the bottom fan. The reservoir mounts are from BitsPower. They came with the reservoir. The reservoir is the BitsPower Z Tube 250 and it's the clear version. So this radiator is going to go in the middle of the Waterbox so that the reservoir is central. I've installed the radiators and I'm taking a look at the different options that I have for the pump and reservoir configuration. I would like the dual pumps to be central as well as the reservoir, but there's really no way of achieving that without making a bit of a mess of the water cooling loop. Now there is a lot of different options for the dual pumps. I could mount them anywhere around the Waterbox. I could also use a BitsPower upgrade kit to mount them directly to the reservoir so that the pumps and reservoir would be a single unit, but then they wouldn't be central. One pump would be central, the other pump would be offset to one side. There's also the matter of the UN mounts. Now don't get me wrong, UN mounts look amazing, but if I could do without them, it is going to look a whole lot cleaner. So I've decided to drop back to a single pump. This means that I can mount the pump directly to the reservoir with a BitsPower upgrade kit, and the pump and reservoir configuration is central in the Waterbox. It also means that I don't have to use the UN mounts, so it looks a whole lot cleaner. Now, for those of you that are concerned about dropping back to a single pump, unless you have a water cooling loop with, say, 4 radiators and 8 water blocks, then dual MCP 655s just aren't necessary. A lot of people underestimate how powerful these pumps are. Most water cooling loops have an overkill pump configuration. Anyway, it's now time to build the water cooling loop. I've now almost completed the water cooling loop. I just have one more section to finish between the inlet and the first radiator. So I'm building the entire loop from BitsPower Black Sparkle fittings and acrylic tube. I'm going for horizontal and vertical 90-degree angles, and I'm trying to mirror the loop as much as possible on either side of the pump and res config. Now a lot of people ask me why I combine certain types of fittings in a loop. For example, in this loop I've combined 90-degree single rotary fittings with 90-degree dual rotary fittings. I've also combined the 2 types of multi-link fittings from BitsPower. There's the normal type of multi-link fitting with 2 O-rings and the multi-link mini with a single O-ring. Now, when building a loop from acrylic tube or building a crystal link configuration, a lot of the time you really don't have a choice of what fittings you are going to use. It's actually very difficult to find the correct fittings to get the angles and lengths that you want. So in this loop I have, a lot of it is horizontal, and to get it horizontal you have to use certain fittings. You can't just go using any fittings you want to match the loop up to make it look uniform. You just have to use the fittings that fit. Now, even though I combine different types of fittings, I always make sure that it's uniform, that I follow some kind of pattern. So with this loop, you can see that I've used 90-degree single rotary fittings on the radiators and on the pump top. Then for the rest of the loop, I've used 90-degree dual rotary fittings. And for the multi-link fittings, I've used the multi-link mini fittings on the radiators, and then the normal type of multi-link fittings for the rest of the loop. So there's almost always ways of following a pattern and keeping things uniform, even when using different types of fittings. So I've also started on the wiring. Now, some of you may be wondering what all these PCBs are for. I have these 3 Mod My Toys 3-way splitters, as well as the Bits Power X station. Now, think about the different ways of wiring this water box. Splitter cables are definitely not the answer. They make an absolute unnecessary mess of wiring. Just consider if I used a 9-way splitter for the fans in this water box. It's a mess, and there's just no way of, cleaning up the cables. So if you use 1 splitter PCB per radiator in any build, it means you can drop the cables straight down to the splitter PCB. You put it right next to the radiator. In this case, I'm going to put it underneath the radiators. It'll be just about completely out of sight. They're black, so they blend in nicely. They come with Velcro for mounting. And then from there, from each splitter PCB, I'll run a single cable back to the Bits Power X station. From the Bits Power X station, I'll be able to power the pump, all of the fans, and anything else. And then I can run a single Molex cable back from the Bits Power X station, and that's how the entire water box will be powered, from 1 Molex connector. So that's definitely the cleanest way of doing things. But some of you might be wondering why I'm using a Bits Power X station as well as the splitter PCBs. Why don't I just connect all of the 9 fans straight to the Bits Power X station? That's because the Bits Power X station only has 4 12-volt 3-pin fan headers. The rest are 7-volt and 5-volt. And I want to run all of the fans at 100%. So I'm going to customize the lengths of all of the cables and sleeve everything in MDPC black. I've now finished the water cooling loop, and I'm also set up and ready to fill the loop. This last little section was surprisingly a little bit tricky. Sometimes you'll find when you're building a loop from acrylic tube and fittings, you'll go through a whole bunch of different fittings until you find the right ones. I also needed to change the section of the loop next to it to make room for it. Now, something that can help if you get stuck, if things are taking too long, I was building the loop from the radiator out to the side of the water box. If you turn around and go back the other way, it can often immediately solve your problems. So I'm not actually going to connect the water box up to a system to fill it or to test it. You can see I've just connected up a piece of tubing from the outlet straight back to the inlet. The tubing that I've used here is Primo Chill Advanced. It's time to fill the water box. So I'm now mixing the Mayhem's coolant, because this is a coolant concentrate. You can actually get the coolant concentrates, or you can get it pre-mixed. But for the concentrates, for Mayhem's Pastel, 250 ml concentrate, so 1 bottle makes 1 litre. For Mayhem's X1, a 250 ml bottle makes 2 litres. And for Mayhem's Aurora, a 250 ml bottle makes 750 mils. I've talked about this previously, but I still get a lot of people asking me why I use a syringe to fill my loops, because it appears to be a slow way of doing things. I use a syringe because it gives me more control than any other filling method, and the priority when filling a loop is preventing spills and leaks, not the time it takes. You certainly don't want to rush and take the quickest filling method. I don't like pouring it into a funnel. I mean, that is the quickest way of doing things, but the risk of spilling coolant is very high. I'd prefer to move more slowly and carefully. The loop is now full and circulating. I'm going to have to leave this loop up and running for probably about 4 to 6 hours for all of the air to come out of the loop. While I'm waiting, I'm going to get started on the wiring. So I have all of the tools and materials laid out here ready to go. If you're going to start doing custom wiring, there is a bit of setup involved, a bit of cost. There's a number of tools that you're going to need, basically just wire strippers, crimpers, side cutters, something to burn the ends of the sleeving and heat the heat shrink. A lighter will certainly do the job. That's what a lot of people use. The materials you need is obviously sleeving of a number of different sizes and heat shrink. And if you're going to be making cables up from scratch, you're going to need pins and connectors. There's a lot of different pins and connectors you need for all the different types of cables. Also wire of a number of different gauges, 18, 22 and 26 should do the job. So anyway, I've started on the wiring. I only had to change the lengths of 5 of the fan cables. The rest of the cables were the correct length. Noise blocker fans come with high quality extension cables. The sleeving is actually very similar to MDPC, as you can see. And because of that, I'm able to work with what's there, shorten the cables. I don't re-sleeve them, I just leave the stock sleeving. And you know, it saves time and materials, and it looks exactly the same anyway. So I've shortened these 5 fan cables. These are going to go straight from the fans to the splitter PCBs. These cables here I've made from scratch, and these are going to go from the splitter PCBs to the Bits Power X station. The Molex cable I've also made up from scratch, and this cable will be to power the entire water box. I've made it fairly long so that the water box can sit about half a meter away from the system. You can see that I've done this cable in heat shrinkless sleeving. You'll often see me doing some cables in heat shrinkless sleeving and some cables with heat shrink in the same build, like I have here. That's because you can only really do cables in heat shrinkless sleeving that have been individually sleeved. The 3-pin fan cables in the background, for example, have 3 wires within the sleeving, so it's just not possible on a lot of cables. I much prefer the aesthetics of heat shrinkless sleeving, and it's also far more durable, so I try to do it as much as possible. The water box is now complete and up and running and ready to be shipped to the lucky winner. So I've changed the design a little bit from what I had in mind originally. There's a number of components I didn't end up using. The temperature gauge, the vandal switch for the lighting. I also have an installed lighting, and as I mentioned, I've dropped back to a single pump. Now, the reason for all of this is that I decided to go for this very clean, elegant, understated aesthetic, and it's because these components are well suited to that. Also, the color scheme is. There's a number of aspects of this build that brought me to this particular aesthetic, and the reason I didn't end up installing the other components is because I wanted to just keep the bare essentials, only the vital components, to keep the design as clean as possible. So you can see that the wiring really blends into the background. All of the wiring just about is actually in view, but it blends into the black background of the water box. The splitter PCBs aren't visible unless you look right down underneath the water cooling loop and radiators, so that worked out really well. The Bits Power X station, I wanted it to be in view because it's the only light source, it's the only lighting in the water box, and it actually gives out a lot of light. It is very bright, and it's a fairly soft light. There is a couple of LEDs on top, but the rest of the LEDs are underneath, and the light shines up through the connectors and puts out a soft glow, and it's in a good position because it's actually lighting up the water cooling loop and putting out a good amount of light behind the pump and pump top. Now, the reason I didn't install lighting is because the water box is open. It's always going to be well lit. It's not as if it's a dark case where you can't see the components. Also because there's nowhere to hide a light source, and you should always try to hide your light sources so that you don't get that hard light. So you can see the fan configuration that I've gone for. It's very simple. I have the 3 fans on each of the radiators connected up to a Mod My Toys splitter PCB. Then I have a single cable going back from the splitter PCB to the Bits Power X station. And those cables are all connected up to the 12 volt 3-pin fan headers on the Bits Power X station. They could easily be swapped to the 7 volt or 5 volt headers on the X station, but that's definitely not going to be necessary because these fans are incredibly silent. This is the first time I've heard this many of these fans running together. And seriously, the only noise you can hear, and this is only if you put your head right down next to them, is a very slight noise of air movement. You can't hear any motor noise or whining. They are very quiet. So I have the pump connected to one of the Molex headers on the Bits Power X station. The pump cable is very short because the X station is obviously right next to the pump. And then I have the big long Molex cable to power the entire water box. Now these clips that I've used on the Molex cable, I've had a lot of questions about these clips. I've also used them in previous builds. They're made by ModSmart, and I have a link in the video description to where you can pick them up from. There's all different colors, a bunch of different types, and they're incredibly useful for cable management, mainly when you're doing custom wiring. So I'm powering the water box with my test bed. The fans and pump are very low powered. The water box really doesn't use much power. Now the reason I'm not giving any temperature results is because, well, the main reason is I don't want to contaminate the loop. If I were to get some decent results for this water box to really show what it can do, I would have to hook it up to my personal primary system, Singularity Beast 2, which currently has blue coolant in the loop. And even if I spent a whole lot of time flushing out the loop, I could still potentially contaminate this loop with blue coolant. Even the slightest amount of color in Mayhem's Pastel Ice White coolant, and you can see it from a mile away. I do actually have a video with some temperature results for the old designs, so I'll put a link on the screen to that video. Now for those of you who are wondering what happens when you connect the water box up to a loop, basically you just need to continue topping up the reservoir until it fills the loop, so you get a whole lot of air in the loop and you need to wait until all of the air comes out again. I'm actually sending some extra tubing and also some extra coolant to the winner. I've had a few people ask me what is the purpose of a water box. Just imagine not having to install any radiators, a reservoir or pumps, or half of the water cooling loop for that matter into your build. It means you can use a very small case, have a compact and lightweight system. All you need to do is install water blocks and a bit of a water cooling loop, and you can still use extremely high-end hardware, but obviously you need to have this separate water box. But it doesn't have to be this big. There is far more compact designs that you could go for that are still very high performance. And if you have quick disconnects like this, it's very easy to unplug and plug back in. I mean, you could take it to a LAN. Instead of having one big heavy system, having 2 lighter ones are going to be easier to deal with, and that's just one scenario. Anyway, that sums up this video. The water box is now complete and I'm going to send it to the winner as soon as possible. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.